It began as a holiday. Started in 2018 as a travel and lifestyle supplement to the budding yet prestigious YouTube channel, the Kino Corner, the Florida Dispatch has since accrued the greatest reporters, writers, and journalists of the entire Southeast. Beau Lechamp, investigative reporting, specializing in drugs, guns, and vice. Carol Duvivier, Florida's utmost expert on alligators and other aquatic reptilians. John Cortez, master of undiscovered history. Samuel Lieberman, the harshest literary critic of the 21st century. Marcel Zanussi, nightlife connoisseur. And then there's me, Isaac Mahaffey, editor, chief of staff, CEO, president, and foremost film critic. Shortly after the beginning of the new year, 2022, I received an unexpected package in the mail, a copy of the French Dispatch, a new competitor from across the pond. Alongside the journal was a small handwritten note. Please review this. Signed, Arthur Howitzer. The French Dispatch, the newest film by renowned film director Wes Anderson, is a collection of short films set within the framework of a magazine. The film consists of an introduction to the magazine and its staff, The Cycling Reporter, a travelogue of the town of Anuy-sur-Blaze, the fictional French town in which the film is set, and 3 short stories. 1. The Concrete Masterpiece. A tax-evading art merchant, Julian Cadazio, notices an exquisite modern art masterpiece in his prison entitled Simone Naked, Cell Block J Hobby Room. He buys the work and, when out of prison, sets out to make the artist, Moses Rosenthaler, a star. A whole new art movement is born, and Moses sets to work on his magnum opus, which could make or break their careers. 2. Revisions to a Manifesto. Lucinda Kremens reports on the student rebellions in Ennui, with her primary focus being on the charismatic leader, Zeffirelli. One day, they're demanding access to the girls' dormitory. The next day, they're staging the historic chessboard revolution. Will their movement collapse due to ideological differences? Will Miss Kremens maintain journalistic neutrality? Will Zeffirelli find love? What are they even fighting for? Number 3. The Private Dining Room. Anderson finishes his 4-course meal of a film with an edge-of-your-seat thriller about police, new beginnings, gangsters, abductions, but most of all, food. Roebuck Wright sits down with the commissaire to enjoy the delectable dishes that the Nescafé has to offer, but they're interrupted by terrible news. The commissaire's son has been kidnapped. What follows is a Hitchcockian game of cat and mouse, a battle of wits and wills, a car chase, a shootout, but most importantly, a very nice dinner. And finally, the film has an epilogue. The film is made to feel like you are watching a magazine, like all the stories and editorials from this magazine are springing to life. It gives the film a certain charm and helps to make The French Dispatch Wes Anderson's most cutting-edge film to date, as well as his most divisive since The Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou. How is it experimental? Well, what immediately comes to mind is Anderson's willy-nilly shifting between color and black and white, as well as between different aspect ratios. Any fan of Anderson should be used to the changing aspect ratio, as he deftly employed that technique in his previous film, The Grand Budapest Hotel. The Grand Budapest Hotel also had some scenes in black and white, but in The French Dispatch, Wes Anderson changes aspect ratios and changes between black and white and color within the same scenes. But why? According to Anderson, he was inspired to adopt this style after watching the documentary Painter's Painting. In that documentary, the filmmakers shoot the interviews in black and white, but photograph the paintings in color. It makes the paintings pop out more to the audience. Anderson borrows this technique for this film, but it has a slightly different effect. It does make certain shots pop, that's for sure, but it also helps to simulate the experience of reading a magazine. It's not uncommon in a human interest article to have photographs with varying dimensions scattered across the pages. Many journalists also keep both color and black and white stock on them during assignments, as both have their advantages and disadvantages to varying circumstances. The cuts to animation also simulate comic strips that one might find in these periodicals. However, when we read the comic strips, our brains imagine the motion. Anderson does the job for us in this movie. Anderson also plays around with language in this film. In artistic whim that began with Isle of Dogs, or perhaps the Grand Budapest Hotel. We can presume that everyone in the film speaks French at all times, aside from what's being spoken at the offices of the French dispatch. But nevertheless, what we hear is a mix of French and English. The utilitarian explanation for this is that many of the actors are not French, and may not know a single word or phrase of the language outside of bonjour, voulez-vous coucher avec moi ce soir, and omelette du fromage. Even if they did speak a bit of it, it might be incredibly difficult for them to convincingly act while speaking a foreign tongue.
Even though that explanation might be correct, it's still a boring one, and I'd rather believe something more exciting even if it wasn't quite as true. So let's set aside the practicalities and examine how this blend of languages affects the film. The alternating use of French and English creates a sort of linguistic rhythm within the film. It's natural for English people to speak slower than the French. Anyone who has ever spent time in France knows this to be true. But the sounds of the languages are also different, and when they're heard side by side, they create a nice harmony of sorts. Wes Anderson also uses subtitles for the French dialogue to add to the visual composition of the frames. The creative use of subtitles brings a new energy to the shots, and it ensures that the visual rhythm of the frame matches the aural rhythm of the soundtrack. Finally, we have to remember that the French Dispatch is a branch of the Liberty, Kansas Evening Sun. Most, if not all, of the readers of that publication won't be fluent in French. All of the articles are thusly written in English, but the journalists may elect to quote some people directly in their native tongue, with translations, of course. And now, we move on to...
In the 11th grade, a young Wes Anderson discovered The New Yorker. It quickly became his favorite magazine, and he'd spend much of the rest of his life poring over the articles and short stories within this prestigious journal. He noted how he would dig up old issues of The New Yorker at his college library and would seek out the J.D. Salinger short stories that never found their way outside of the publication's pages. It should come as no surprise, then, that the French Dispatch is an homage to The New Yorker, especially to The New Yorker of the early to mid-20th century, during the reigns of Harold Ross, The New Yorker's co-founder, and William Shawn, his successor. Both of these men would serve as the primary inspiration for Bill Murray's character of Arthur Howitzer Jr., the editor of the French Dispatch. As for the esteemed journalists of the Francet Journal, they were all inspired by real-life reporters, writers, photographers, and personalities. Tilda Swinton's J.K.L. Berenson was inspired by the Francophilic art journalist Rosamond Bernier. Frances McDormand's Lucinda Crements was inspired by Mavis Gallant, who wrote on the Parisian student rebellions in May 1968. Jeffrey Wright's Roebuck Wright was inspired by James Baldwin, Tennessee Williams, and A.J. Liebling. And Owen Wilson's Herb Saint-Césaire was inspired by Joseph Mitchell and Bill Cunningham.
On top of the rich journalistic inspirations, the French Dispatch draws from a deep well of cinematic inspirations. Some of the directors who served as major influences on the film are Hitchcock, Truffaut, Godard, Becker, Clouzot, Duvivier, Renoir, Tati, Coppola, Visconti, Cavalcanti, Mamoulian, Malle, De Sica, Hawks, and Wilder. I have a list of all 32 films listed in the journal for the French Dispatch on my Letterboxd, which I'll link in the description. As preparation for this video, I watched every single one of these films on the list. Was that overkill? Yes. Yes, it was.
The idea to make an anthology film in which only one director made all of the shorts came from Vittorio De Sica's The Gold of Naples.
Let me put some shots from some of the movies that inspired the French Dispatch side by side with shots from the French Dispatch so that you can best see the visual inspirations.
Wes Anderson has always been a Francophilic director. Going back to his early work, you can see how he incorporated several shots that served as references to French New Wave films. I've maintained for years that Anderson is a sort of American French New Wave director, and with the release of his latest film, my conviction is only stronger. Just look at Timothee Chalamet's turn as Zeffirelli. It's quite obvious that he is channeling Jean-Pierre Léaud in this film, as the character feels ripped out of something like La Chinoise. The French Dispatch, as I see it, is the culmination of his entire career of artistic progression and influences. Just as Wes Anderson shot the Grand Budapest Hotel in an abandoned department store in a German small town, he shot The French Dispatch in an abandoned felt factory in Angoulême, France. The film employed over 900 local extras and actors, as well as an impressive list of almost 50 speaking roles, many of which were filled by A-list talent. However, if we are to believe Bill Murray, they were all probably paid minimum wage.
We are promised very long hours and low wages.
One of the most crucial pieces of the film are the works of art that the character Moses Rosenthaler creates. For that, Anderson hired artist Sandro Kopp, who was tasked with creating Rosenthaler's masterpieces in 2.5 months. In the film, Rosenthaler takes 3 years to create his work. So, in a certain light, you could say that Kopp is 14.4 times better than Rosenthaler. Kopp drew from the likes of Francis Bacon, Jenny Saville, William de Kooning, and Frank Auerbach as references and inspirations, among others. He worked tirelessly on the paintings, working alongside Anderson to get everything looking just right. In one instance, Anderson proposed to him to attack the painting with a knife upon completing it. Kopp would paint on set and apply finishing touches up until the moment that Anderson called action. Even then, he would still paint while the cameras rolled. When you see Moses painting in the film, the hand is not the actor's, but Kopp's. While we're discussing the art in the film, Angoulême, France is the home to a comic art school and many animation studios. Gwen Germain directed the animated sequences in the film and used a small team of local illustrators for all the cartoon sequences. A whopping 125 sets were constructed for the film, overseen by longtime Anderson collaborator Adam Stockhausen. Many of the sets were inspired by Orson Welles' The Trial, especially the prison set. Stockhausen liked how Welles showed the edges of his sets in his 1962 film, and how you could tell that the film was shot in a train station, Gare d'Orsay to be specific. It added a theatricality and artifice to the film that Adam and Wes wanted to replicate. Many of the sets also mixed built sets with matte paintings that were made to make the sets look much larger than they actually were. Perhaps my favorite stunt pulled off in the production design is the sliding of the walls and revisions to a manifesto. It seamlessly moves the camera from the exterior to the interior, while also adding to the staginess of the scene. Shooting in both black and white and color 35mm film also caused some concerns on set. How does a light color, like a baby blue or a yellow, look in black and white? How are the sets to be painted, the makeup done, and the costumes made to allow for easy switching between monochrome and color? It's more of a headache than you probably think.
Everyone knows that Wes Anderson is specific in his approach. You can find many videos here on YouTube talking about the symmetry in his frames or the diorama style of his movies. I've talked previously in my video about Moonrise Kingdom how Wes has a vision but is by no means a tyrant on set. He just prepares everything very well. He creates detailed animatics for his movies so that everyone in the cast and crew knows exactly what he is trying to achieve. An animatic, for those unaware, is a film storyboard with voiceover and other aural cues.
He needed it for this film especially, considering how many effect shots there are, from the people frozen in frame to the dolly tracks through several sets. A movie of this magnitude would have been impossible to pull off without Wes's attention to detail and discipline of planning. Even still, much had to be fixed or tweaked in post. Many shots in The French Dispatch contain hidden CGI or computer-generated fixes. Take this shot of the town of Ennui waking up in the morning. This one shot consists of 12 different shots meshed together into one frame. The editor, Andrew Weisblum, admits that there are probably around 20 shots in the film like this one, and that whenever there are two characters in a scene, it's probably an invisible split screen. The art is in the invisibility of the modifications. Wes and his crew, in this film at least, act not just as artisans, but as magicians.
This section will contain spoilers for every short story within The French Dispatch. If you are afraid of spoilers, then I can't help you. You shouldn't have clicked on an analysis video of a movie you haven't seen if you don't want to be spoiled. That's on you. It only makes sense to proceed through this chronologically. So, let's start with
the concrete masterpiece. What is the value of art? Is it just the value of the picture sans contexte, or does the painting also derive value from its creator? the culture, the viewer, the merchant, and the overall cultural context in which it was made and in which it's being sold. When Julian Cadazio lays his eyes on Rosenthaler's work in the prison, he knows there's something special to it, even if he doesn't understand it. He concludes that the painting is good, not based on anything the painting has to offer, but because Rosenthaler displays his incredible artistic skill to him by drawing a perfect sparrow. Still, there's an uphill battle to turn Rosenthaler into a star and to give value to his works. None of the other art dealers at his shop understand the initial painting, but they trust in Cadazio's vision, and so they work to give the painting value by creating a cult of personality around Rosenthaler. Books are written, schools of art spring forth around his style, copycats are born, and so on. He becomes an iconoclastic cultural icon. At this point, does it even matter if his magnum opus is good? If these people don't even really understand his work, then how can they determine the quality of his work? We look at the paintings, presented to us in anamorphic widescreen and in vibrant color, and we can tell that these works, although abstract, are beautiful, but there's a deep layer of irony to the whole affair. We believe Cadazio when he denigrates the work, but we believe him just as much when he praises it a few moments later. I guess that in this case, the only objective measure we can use to determine its quality is the price that the buyer paid for it. In this case, it's a hefty sum, so I guess it's quite a fine work of art. Revisions to a Manifesto. This story might be the most rooted in actual history. In May of 1968, student rebellions broke out in France. These protests and occupations lasted for nearly 2 months, stemming from far-left student groups, but growing bigger and more out of control over time. It even led to the then-president Charles de Gaulle going into hiding, a revolution almost happening, violence in the streets, barricades, counter-protests, and overall chaos. In the film world, echoes of these protests were heard at the Cannes Film Festival, where directors like Godard and Truffaut caused a bit of trouble to get the festival annulled in support of the student movements. At one point, they and others hung onto the curtains in a cinema to prevent a film, Peppermint Frappé, from being shown. The chessboard revolution of Zeffirelli exists in the shadow of May '68. It's both historical and fantastical in its presentation. Anderson imbues in this story a bit of satire, highlighting the philosophical differences between many of the students. Their ideological purity spiraling, their infights between idealists and pragmatists caused a revolution to fail. Illustrating this tug-of-war is a love triangle that is at the heart of the story. Zeffirelli is drawn to both Miss Cremens and to the younger Juliette, who represent the pragmatic older generation and the more extreme younger generation, respectively. The way Zeffirelli and his movement find a way forward is to have Cremens and Juliette reach a compromise with one another. They might have lost the chessboard revolution, but their movement will live on to fight another day, and next time they'll be stronger. Or not. Zeffirelli dies a poetic hero. He was a rebel up to the last second of his short life. He was in love. He was handsome. He was the face of the new generation. A face that would be printed en masse and sold on t-shirts, coffee cups, posters, and all sorts of other kinds of merchandise to young people who fancied themselves rebels. Zeffirelli, in his crusade against the capitalist system, made that same capitalist system a lot of money. So in the end, who really won? The Private Dining Room. Anderson ends his 4-course meal of a film with a short film about food. Or at least it's supposed to be about food, until some gangsters kidnap the commissaire's son, holding him as hostage and advocating for the death of the abacus. Food, crime, and action serve as window dressing for a story that is about the experience of living as a foreigner in a strange land. Wes Anderson, who has lived in Paris for many years, no doubt wrote from experience. A city like Ennui or Paris can be wonderful and magical, but that doesn't mean it's home. No matter what, if you are an American, like Roebuck Wright, then you'll always be an American. The French Dispatch serves as an oasis for these American expats who need a place and a people who are familiar, not just fellow countrymen, but fellow countrymen who are also expats and foreigners. It's fitting that Roebuck Wright should review food, as cultures collide best at the dinner table. The commissaire is French through and through. Wright is American. The commissaire's son is from the colonies, which is a reference to the film Quai des Orfèvres, and Nescaffier is Korean. Their dinner serves as a communion between the East and the West, and while one dinner is used to formulate a winning plan to rescue the little boy, another dinner is used to actually rescue the boy. Nescaffier poisons the radishes in the dinner, a food that Nescaffier knows the boy hates. Through his cooking, he conveys a deep understanding and affection of the commissaire and his son. But this second meal leads to perhaps the greatest scene in the entire film. Roebuck talks to Nescaffier while the latter recovers from the poison, and Nescaffier states that he tasted a new flavor with the poison, something he had never tasted before in his life. We all know that to taste it again would mean certain death, that it's a new and interesting flavor that he can never experience again. Could it be the feeling of being at home, of being accepted as a native in a foreign country? Perhaps it's the unique flavor of death, a brush with the other side that puts everything in this world into perspective. Even if this moment is ambiguous, it's still poignant. There's an emotional truth to this revelation, and in my opinion, this singular scene elevates the French Dispatch from good to great.
That's the best part of the whole thing. That's the reason for it to be written.
The French Dispatch ends at the beginning. Arthur Howitzer Jr. dies, and the rest of the staff put together one last issue of the titular magazine. Cesarac utters the opening words.
It began as a holiday.
Is this true? Sort of. It throws into question the exact truthfulness of some of the parts of the movie, but even if some details and exactitudes might not be 100% true, they represent the truth, and that is good enough. So, The French Dispatch is a Morbius strip of a film. You can restart it right after the final shot of the movie, and it continues to flow. This movie is a time capsule of a time that never happened, and a cultural relic of a town that never existed. In short, it's a Wes Anderson movie.
That was good. The part about the poison, can you expand a bit more on that?
There's something illusory about that scene. I have all the feelings about it. I know how I feel about it. I know how it affects me, but I just can't quite vocalize it. But I think the thing that I take away from this scene the most is the camaraderie between the two characters. They share this special bond, not because they're from the same country or the same culture, but because they're both expats in this strange and foreign land. They both have that shared experience. It's a scene that's filled with this deep longing and intense melancholy.
Why don't you just say it like that? Just make it sound like you wrote it that way on purpose.